James Mansfield attends the Christadelphian Church or ecclesia that meets at Enfield in Adelaide. At a meeting held in Adelaide in September 1993, 30 years ago this month, the idea of starting a Christadelphian Private School was tabled. Following a positive finding of a feasibility study that was conducted by Bruce Gurd, Luke and James Mansfield, a planning committee was initiated. A Christadelphian Primary School commenced operation on the 31st of January 1996, just 2.5 years from the initial tabling of the idea. James shares his reflection of those years with us on Wilderness Conversations. James, thanks very much for joining Wilderness Conversations. Before we get into the subject of Heritage College, I'd love to learn a little bit about you. Tell us something about your background, where you grew up and what your influences were in your early life.
Steve, I'm an Adelaide boy, have always been, and I think it's too late for me to make any changes, being over 80 now. But what I did is education. I'm a qualified accountant. I had a job with the Health Fund, and I had that for really my whole working life was there. And that has sort of given me the background, I think, to help up with the issue of developing and making a greenfield startup with Heritage College. I have 4 children, or we do have 4 children. I'm married to Glenys Mansfield, and being a James Mansfield, of course, that adds an added layer of complications. I think there's still about 5 of us around, but mine's the Adelaide one, and I think I'm the most senior of them age-wise. So if you're thinking of a young person, that's not me that's speaking to you now. But we've got, what...
You don't even know, do you? You've forgotten.
I don't.
You've lost track of how many grandkids and great-grandkids you have. A lot. You've got a crew.
Yeah, I've got a crew. Dear, how many grandchildren and great-grandchildren have we got? She doesn't even know, Steve. I think we got 12 grandchildren and 9 great-grandchildren, and soon, God willing, to be 10.
And changing all the time.
Changing all the time, and we're delighted with them. Lovely.
Yeah, that's a blessing, isn't it? What ecclesia did you grow up in, and where did you spend most of your time?
Well, I was spent my childhood years at Woodville, and then I was actually baptised in the Adelaide Halifax Street ecclesia. But then when I met up with Glenys Saltmars, as she was a member of Enfield. And so what we did, I decided to transfer my membership with Enfield. And so that would be, in 1963, we moved to Enfield, and that's where we've been ever since.
I'm interested to hear about yourself as a young person. What were some of the influences and your decision to get baptised? I mean, even though you grow up in a Christadelphian family, it's not a given you get baptised. What were some of the influences and the reasons that, I guess, made you make that decision?
We had an amazing group of young people with that, Steve, and they were a great influence to us all. People like, we were very much influenced by John Martin. And back in the very early years, we had George Hawkins living here, and he was much older than most of us. And he had quite an influence for good on us. But we had like Pete Weller, Jim Luke, Gordon Franklin, Jeff Berry, John Knowles. So we had a large group of young people. And I'd say to you, Steve, my youth, I really enjoyed it immensely. We had a wonderful time together, very happy, very delightful. And then, of course, I met up with this Glenys Saltmarsh, and she was brought to the meeting by Di Johnson, now Di Franklin, and we then she chased me for a long time.
Not what I heard.
I hope you edit that out. Anyway,
Definitely not.
that's right. So, yes, so that was the background in my youth.
That's great. You mentioned that you worked for the health fund. What health fund was it, and what were some of the roles you had? Was that like a lifetime career? You started young and worked your way through?
Yes, I did. I joined the fund as an assistant accountant, and then moved up through those ranks of. I only kept the books once, and the boss, my then chief executive, he said, "I want to take you out of that role and put you into IT." So I got involved in technology. I've never written a program in my life, but it was really a matter of just trying to use your staff to give you the information and making a decision as to what they tell you. And then I became operations manager and then eventually the CEO.
So you mentioned it was a great background for some of the work you did in the ecclesia over time as well.
That's right. It was. I think what I found was that, I had to do a lot of work on planning, naturally, in that role. And of course, you would spend your time on planning through a particular project. And what tend to happen is, notwithstanding all that planning, somewhere along the line, it would come unstuck. And you would then have to seek ways and means to address the situation. But when it came to heritage, it was so different in as much as all your problems appeared up front. And as you moved into them, they then just dissipated. And it was the very opposite to what I'd experienced commercially. But I do think that background helped me to do a greenfield startup with heritage. We always wondered why it was that you would end up as a CEO. What was that experience for? And in the end, we concluded it was very much to start the school project.
Well, let's get into that subject because it's an extraordinary story. Perhaps let's start with, where did the idea and I guess the initiative for the school come from?
In Adelaide, we still do, but regularly from time to time, meetings with the arranging brethren of all the ecclesias here. And it was at one of those meetings that I was present at, and one of our brethren from a country ecclesia then described the issues he was facing with his children in the school at that country town. And it was a matter where related to sex education, and what they were then doing under the guidance of the teacher actually horrified me. And I was sitting there thinking, my grandchildren are going to go through this. Do we have to, why do we have to expose them to all of that? And I thought, if I start to raise the question at this meeting and say, oh, look, why don't we consider our own school? Because I felt that we needed to move them out of that environment if it was possible, that if I speak up, you'll end up with the job. And that's exactly what happened. I did speak up and I did say, hey, can we create a Christadelphian school so that we can avoid these issues? And this is 30 years ago now, Steve. What they are today, I can't tell you. I don't know. But people like Andrew Johns, who was involved, as you know, deeply with the school as heading up the secondary area, he said to me, James, you wouldn't know what goes on in classrooms today. I think parents don't know. They might have thought, well, I was at school 5 years ago. And he said, what happens today is quite different from what happened 5 years ago. Now, that was 30 years ago.
And that's changed again.
And it's changed again. And so I think in that respect, Steve, it was at that meeting, we moved that we should investigate the feasibility of a school. And that was then done by a committee of three of us, myself, Bruce Gurd, and our dear brother Bruce, who's passed away, and of course, Brian Luke. And then we're talking at an event that occurred in September 93. That was the meeting of the arranging brethren. And we then, a few months later, put up the proposal that, yes, it was feasible. And so that's when they said, righto, well, you're the committee that come up with their report. You then take on that project.
What were some of the things that came into consideration with regard to feasibility?
Well, what I found was that it was not a major issue. There was not much required of us to set up a school. In Adelaide at the time, I don't think it applies now, we had to establish the school in a growth area. That was a bit of a challenge to limit where we could go. So it'd be more difficult if you wanted to set up a school in Adelaide City or something like that. That'd be more challenging. Yes, it would be, because that would not be a growth area. And in fact, we realised that the only growth area that we had that related to the conditions was Golden Grove, the Golden Grove Ecclesial Hall, because we thought we'd use an ecclesia facilities to start with. And so, yes, that did limit our approach.
So you went back to the group and said, we think it's feasible, and they sort of commissioned you to get into it, I guess.
That's right, exactly. So the three of us then got together, and we knew that what was required of us to start the school was finance and, of course, location. And they were the main issues when it came to the matters of the school development. We decided we would start only with the primary school and then grow into secondary. And so they were the matters that we then proposed back to the combined arranging group. Yes, we'll go with start the school using Golden Grove's facility because they were in the growth area. They had an ecclesial hall. And of course, as you could appreciate, the ecclesial halls are being used at the time when the school's not required, but when the school would have students there, there's no ecclesial activity. And so that gave us the opportunity to use that time when the ecclesial hall was not available, we could use it for the school. And so that's the way we started. And in fact, that was then developed, and we got approval to start the school at Golden Grove. However, when it came to the knowledge of the developer in the Golden Grove area, he said, you will not build that school. We will oppose it, and we will take you to court if the Golden Grove Ecclesia then adds a school to their own ecclesial activities. And
right. Why was the developer opposed to it?
He was opposed to it on the basis that he'd sold land around the school, and that had been sold on the basis that Golden Grove's hall would only be used for religious purposes. And they were concerned that if we then started up a school, that the developer could be held responsible for misleading.
So the people that had bought blocks of land, because it was a fairly new development, I guess, back then.
It was.
So people who bought blocks of land would argue that they'd been misled, that there's now a school close by which they weren't anticipating, or something like that.
Exactly. That was their case. And we, in fact, took advice on the matter, and we could use the facility that Golden Grove had for church and church-related activities. And the advice we received was that the school was a church-related activity, and therefore you were well within our bounds to establish a school there. But we decided at that stage, even though we had full approval from all the education authorities to start a school, but we didn't want to do it with it commencing on the basis of litigation. And so we said, righto, we can't do it there. We've got to go elsewhere. And we felt even that in itself, as you reflect back, Steve, was providential. What I must say to you is that the whole development of the school indicated to us that the Father's blessing was with us. He was there to help us through it. And as I said before, when a problem arose, they were always solved. And if I can achieve anything in this particular interview, it would be to remind our brethren and sisters in this city that that school was of Yahweh. God had given us that school, and therefore it was a benefit from him, and therefore we should do everything we can to address the need that was there, and that is the development of our own children in a godly environment. And he certainly indicated to us, if we look at providence in the development of that school, he indicated to us that that was the case. Bear in mind, we're 30 years down the track now, and none of the children have seen an environment here without a Christadelphian school, and even many of the parents. And many would be unaware of the divine hand that was there to start that school up.
There's a number of Christadelphian heritage colleges around Lake Macquarie, Sydney. I think there's one in Perth, Melbourne, of course. This was the first one, was it not?
It was the first, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it was breaking in that respect, Steve. We didn't know where we were really heading, even though you can look at things as you would appreciate, even with your background, that you can look at things in theory, but when it comes to the practice, yeah, it's different.
There's so many pieces that go together to make up a school. You need kids, you need staff, you need a curriculum. You've just mentioned you need a location, government funding. What comes first? Because you've got all of these pieces, all of which, I guess if one piece doesn't work, all of the others fall over. So how did you go about getting all of those pieces together? Did you start with one and then work through them in serial, or did you work them all in parallel? How did you do that?
They were some in parallel and some serially, but what related to our big issue from the outset was location.
Yeah. So you said if we can get a location, we know we can get government funding, and you were confident that it would be supported by parents, and you would get teachers. So you sort of made that assumption, I guess.
That's right. We thought we were in a situation where we knew, not having had experience in this, that there would be some reticence by parents to say, I don't want to risk my child's education with something that's never been tried and tested. So that was one issue that they faced. We started off with the Golden Grove area with 90 only children enrolled. We decided we would go with the primary school first because that was easier. And then as we grew and as the time expired, we'd move into secondary. And so as far as teachers were concerned, we took the approach that we would guarantee their salary in as much as what you're earning now is what you will earn if you join Heritage School, so that they wouldn't lose. But of course, a number of them actually took leave of absence so that their position was somewhat protected so that they could move back into the public sector where most of them came from. But in all of this, it was location really that was the greatest challenge. So
tell us a little more about the location then. So you decided to not go with Golden Grove, but did you decide that after you had an alternative? I mean, if the alternative hadn't have come, would you have gone with Golden Grove? How did that work?
Oh, no, we would have gone with Golden Grove if we didn't face the legal challenge. But having that before us and deciding that we will not proceed and as we say, risk a school commencing with the background of litigation, we then, what was emerging in Adelaide, and I was looking at it for a totally different reason. In fact, I was looking at it perhaps as an alternative for the Enfield ecclesia. We were struggling with car parking and so on. And so I thought what was coming on the market was a psychiatric hospital. And back in those days, they institutionalized all of our patients requiring psychiatric care. And so what we then saw, or what was drawn to our attention was a property that was coming on the market, and this is where our brother Gordon Franklin also got involved in the real estate, where there was this 60 hectares, that's 145 acres of land with buildings on them that were there that the government was probably they thought the best use was for a university. So that's the size of it.
Mm.
Now, that failed. They couldn't do that. And so we were then in a situation where they said to us, well, look, if you would like, we'll sell it piecemeal. You have a look at the buildings there. And if you find something that's suitable, we'll consider selling the land to you.
So they were prepared to subdivide and make it more accessible.
Yeah, they knew then that's the only outcome that they could face, is that they would subdivide it and become residential property. And so there was this particular building that we looked at that was really very, very useful in respect to refurbishing. It had solid external walls. It had a roof that spanned from one wall to the next. So that then meant that the internal walls were not structural. And whatever was internally in that building, we could knock down and rebuild according to our own personal needs. It had gas, it had electricity, so it was serviced as well as water and sewer. So it had all those facilities so that we could then modify it to make it as useful as we could with a school. And so we then said that we would take 1.5 hectares as something like 27,000 square feet, and the government was selling it for land value only, because otherwise they were going to demolish any property that was there. And so we got the building, as it were, thrown in, and that gave us a head start. Because the one thing that was required, Steve, that I hadn't mentioned was in a challenge was finance.
The small matter of money.
And money then loomed very large in this whole process. So that's where the challenges that we faced. Now, it was rather ironic, another providential feature, because this facility was within, I think the figure was 5 kilometres of Golden Grove Hall, we could simply move the licence to these new premises. So we didn't have to go through a whole reapplication. So
right.
That was another factor.
Yep.
But in the process of doing that, there was another school being developed not far, actually a stone's throw, called Cedar College. And Cedar College got upset that the government would allow us to develop our school within a stone's throw of their school. So the government then came to us and said, look, what we'd like to do is address this problem on the basis of some form of compromise. Would you be prepared not to enrol non-Christadelphian students at your school? Otherwise, you'll be taking them from the same catchment area as the new school that we've approved that's only a stone's throw from you. So they said to us, we want you to make that school Christadelphians only.
Mm.
Well, we had to reluctantly, tongue-in-cheek, give way to that. So that's why our school in Adelaide is one reason, Christadelphian only, because the government asked us to commit to that approach. So
does that restriction still apply today, do you think, or has it not been tested because the school wants that policy anyway?
The school wants that policy at the moment as it stands, and I hope it's retained because, we have, as you know, Steve, we've got sufficient numbers to operate a school with the students in Adelaide. We don't need to go elsewhere. But so that's the way in which it operates. But it was a condition required of us at the time.
And so the raising of the finance then, how was that done?
Well, what happened there was that we then had to raise something like $750,000 Now, we did it in several ways. First of all, we could negotiate with the government. They liked the idea of the preservation of some of those buildings and recycling them. And so we had their support. And we said that the big challenge we've got is that we have limited finance. So what we did is then agreed with them that we would pay off the land and the buildings over a period of time. And in the process then, so with a scheduled cash flow requirement, we then were able to raise money from our own brotherhood. And of course, as you know, we have quite a number of Christadelphian ecclesias and families. And so we were able then to raise the finance. I do remember as we were developing it and we were looking at something like $750,000, it made me very nervous. We'd never faced such a capital raising project in Adelaide like that before.
Well, you've gone from the assumption that you're going to have it at Golden Grove, where there would be minimal finance involved. It'd be more like a cash business where you pay your teachers and get the money from the government. Now you're investing, so it's a whole nother scenario, isn't it?
Actually, that's very true. No, that's very true with this whole thing, Steve. I remember speaking to our dear brother John Martin, and John saying to me, "What do you plan?" And I said, "John, I'm not sleeping because we've never faced in this city the challenge of trying to raise $750,000, as it were, overnight." I said, "Maybe we're going to scale back." He said, "No, go for it and place it in the Father's hands. And if it's a project that he will support, you'll be blessed." And we were. And so what we did then, as I think I inferred, we staged the financial terms. The government liked the idea of recycling their old building, so they knew that it was a greenfield startup and they were prepared to do what they could to make it successful, and they did. And so we were very blessed in that respect.
So what sort of time frame did they help you over?
Well, they helped. Well, we ended up with a 3-year period of the payment for it. And they said during that period, you don't pay for rates, taxes, or water, or any of those services. And of course, what we then did, we had more building than we had need to start with. So that what we could do is that we had this shell where we retained the external structure of the footings, of the walls, the roof, and all we needed to do was to really convert that into classrooms that suited our purpose. Not easy. It was a big challenge, but what also helped us, and we must say this, Steve, was its extraordinary support that we gained from brethren and sisters to help us develop this school, because it was greenfield startup, not only in the structural issues, but also in the concept. And that indicated in all of this, if I could do one thing, and I've always said this, was to indicate it was an evidence of the blessing from the Heavenly Father that we could do this. And we are very thankful to him. And if anyone's listening to this, particularly in Adelaide, would be to recognise that we would not have had that school had it not been for the Father's blessing.
The whole thing happened so quickly, like from the conception of the idea to actually going live and opening up on sort of day one, it was just a little over 2 years. And in that time, you've changed location, you've found a new site. How much time did you have once you'd sort of settle on the site to getting that ready to then sort of get it ready for the opening day?
Well, that also we thought was an indication of the Father's blessing with us, because we had not signed any documents with the government, but they allowed us to take the building over and to start to redevelop it and convert it, refurbish it as a school. And we hadn't signed any papers, but the government let us into one of their properties, and we were pulling down walls, internal walls, and we were doing all of that. And we felt that we could not achieve that without the Father's blessing. And so from the time when we said, right, we want to go with it, and they gave us the key, they said, come in next Saturday. And from then, with the opening, was 52 days. And to us, that was a marvellous sign. I know Brother Bill Lunn indicated that to us. We had 52 days to get that school ready. So that was the same time that Israel had to build the walls of Jerusalem.
Oh, under Nehemiah.
Under Nehemiah. And we thought that was an amazing omen for us. If the Father could bless Nehemiah and his work, we would receive the same blessing if he felt that was appropriate. So we had 52 days exactly to do that, and that was extraordinary.
So the buildings, and particularly this main building, was it fit for purpose? Did you have to do much in by way of renovation? It was an old building, I'm assuming, because it was an old institution, so it would have been quite old, I imagine. And what about things like asbestos and things like that?
Yeah, no, it had a number of challenges in that regard. The walls, the external walls, were very sound, probably overbuilt, but that applied in those days. They would overbuild them. So the walls and the roof were good. Some internal walls were very useful. But what we then found was that it did have asbestos in that building, but the asbestos was below the floor. It was underfloor asbestos, because what they did is they heated up the old hospital, as it was, from a steam room, which they pumped right through that area or that acreage.
So what would have been old asbestos, lagged pipes and things like that?
Exactly. And so we were concerned about that. But what happened there was that there was the government authority that was in charge of issues such as asbestos. And they said to us, if you can shut that off, conceal it, we will allow that to happen. We will allow the use of that facility. And it just so happened that with that, the pipes underneath, there was 1 kilometre of lagging that was around those pipes. And so we thought, if we could seal that off and proceed, we might get somewhere. However, we did go back to the government from whom we were buying the building and said to them, now look, we have agreed upon a certain price for this building, but now we've got to remove the asbestos that we didn't know about because it was under the floor of the facility of the building. You've got to pull that out if we don't proceed. So what we'd like you to do is to fund us so that we can pull it out, because we need that removed. And so they then said, well, right, you need some approval for that. And it just so happened that a brother was the person who had to give that approval. And so he helped us. This was another example.
So this was a brother who was working for the authority.
That's right.
Right.
Yes. So he said, look, if you can seal it off, that'll be good enough for the moment, but then you've really got to get it out of the place eventually. And so that's what did happen. We got a price on what it would cost to remove it. The property values were reduced by that price so that it was left with us to do it. And so we then did it later and got it all removed.
So there were 52 days. You had this building that you needed to get ready for a school to open up on the 30th of January 1996. So you had a deadline.
We had a deadline. And it was amazing the support we got. That was another indication of the Brotherhood's support for the whole project. We would get 50, 60 people would come, without exaggerating, and would come on weekends to help with it. We had people that took annual leave to help with it. We had a marvellous support from the Brotherhood, and that was certainly a blessing that we received to be able to get it done. What must be acknowledged, of course, is that great work done in the development of the college by Bill London, Sister Pauline. They had to leave New Zealand to take up a job here that, in their case, had so much unknown in it, and there had no security associated with it. We had to make it work. And that was also followed by, of course, Andrew Johns. Our dear brother Andrew has since passed away. He did an amazing job as well in the development of the school. And so there was a number that you could add to that list of those that ensured the success of the school, but particularly Bill, leaving New Zealand to take up a role, and of course Andrew leaving the security of his public school role.
So did you get most of it done with sort of almost voluntary labour? I mean, I know there's builders and plumbers and I guess labourers and so on.
That's right. It's an amazing resource within the Brotherhood. We got all of it done by brethren who were prepared to volunteer their services. The only thing we had to actually buy was someone, I think, to lay the carpet and someone to the fire hydrants and so on. We had to buy that. But otherwise, it was all done by the generosity of our brethren and sisters in this city.
So 52 days?
52 days.
The time of opening came.
Yeah, 52 days. And the time.
You had enough children, you had the teachers all lined up, it was ready to go?
Yes, it was. When we were going to proceed by the use of the Golden Grove Hall, we had 90 students enrolled. But when we went to this standalone facility, that then grew to 120, and it was only primary school. And what we were going to do then was to gradually, year after year, then increase the facility to operate in secondary. So that would be year 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And so that was going to happen progressively. But really, after 2 years, we then, in fact, had the school available for anyone who wanted to enrol in primary or secondary education. So it was an amazing support by the Brotherhood. It captured their imagination, and we were able to get their generous support to get that school done in that time.
And you had a big unveiling when it was ready to go?
Yes, we did. We had it was so funny with it, Steve. We thought, here we are at the time of the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem under Ezra and Nehemiah. They had 52 days, and we did, and it rained when of course the walls of Jerusalem were opened, and we thought, here we are in the middle of summer in Adelaide, where we don't get much rain. Wouldn't it be extraordinary if it would rain on the day that we opened that school? So we had an evening, I believe it was a Monday or Tuesday evening, and we're there and we're talking, and it rained. And for Adelaide, rain in summer, it's very unique.
It is rare, yeah.
And it was just extraordinary. When we did open it, there was a bit of a challenge there, because I had to take responsibility for opening the school without it receiving full building approval. because it was just a political thing that happened. But we then proceeded with the opening as planned. But the one thing that happened that I must talk about, Steve, was the fact that we had a school, and what we had to do in the end was to get building planning and building approval. And that necessitated us using our Port Adelaide Enfield Council. It's now December, and we've got about 30 days in which to get the finality of the building and opening to occur. But the biggest issue was the building requirements to get approval for building and planning and the use of that building for that purpose as a school. I went to the Port Adelaide Enfield Council, under whose jurisdiction it operates, and said to them, we need to have approval for that school to meet your requirements. He said to me, James, I can't give you approval. I said, why can't you? He said, you haven't got access to a site. You've got a block of land where you've got buildings on it, but you have not got access to it. The only way you can gain access to that site is by building a roadway from public roads through property that the state government owns to your school. Because just bear in mind, our school is sort of, how would I describe it? It's surrounded by land that we weren't purchasing, that we did.
Right. So this is a function going back to the original early when you said you took part of the land, not all of the land.
That's
so you ended up with almost like a landlocked piece of land
exactly.
in that sense.
That's
right.
It was landlocked.
Yeah.
And so I said he said to me, James, I can't even look at your application. You're landlocked. You haven't got right to access that building. So I went back to the department and said to them, I want a right of way over your property. That's the only way we can do it. So they gave it to us the next day. It was rather extraordinary. We got the right of way to go over government property. They had roads there, of course, but they were owned by the government, not by us.
Mm.
And then it went on to say, all right, James, you've addressed that. But now you've got to go through the whole process, I think, as you might understand, Steve, as others would, that you've got to seek approval from your neighbours.
Yeah, so often there's a period of notification and all of that sort of stuff goes on to get your building development, don't you?
Exactly. And he said, so what you've got to do is you lodge your application with us that you're going to establish a school in that area. Then we've got to go out to the public and see if there is going to be objections to it. And then it's got to be open for that. Then we've got our council meetings, and here it is, right to the end of December. It's just not possible. And I said, we've got to open it. So I said to the town planner at the Port Adelaide Enfield Council, what can you do? He said, I'm going to do everything I can to help you with it. I said, why are you going to do that? He said, Rupert Murdoch has bought land in that same development alongside you, and he's gone above me. He's gone to the government, our state government, to get approval for his development to build a soccer pitch there alongside the school. And he said they should do it through me, and I'm so incensed with that. I will do everything in my power to get your school going. So it's another case of providence. And so here was Rupert Murdoch, well, his son actually. He landed on the site by the school there in a helicopter.
So this is Lachlan Murdoch, was it?
Yes, it was.
So you got an advantage by a government official who was being a little A little jealous, perhaps.
He was absolutely peeved by it. And anyway, we said, okay, how can we go about it? I need your support. He said, I will do everything I can, James. I want you to have your project going. You've gone through the right channels. These guys alongside you, the Murdochs, they have gone above me, and I don't like that. Anyway, I said, well, how can we do it? He said, what we'll do is, in essence, you've only got two neighbours. You normally go through this process, as we would say, you'd lodge your application. We'd call for the public exposure of it, and people have got 30 days to object, and then we have another meeting, and then we listen to their objections, and so it goes on. He said, you'd never do that. You've got less than 30 days by now to do that. So he said, what I'll do, he said, I'll waive that on the basis that your only neighbours you've got is the state government who own the land.
Who've sold you the land for the very purpose.
Exactly. So that wasn't difficult to come by. And of course, then a developer who likes the idea of a school being alongside their development. So the next day we got their approval. So he said, I'll waive the rest of it and you can proceed. So that was another example, I felt, extraordinary example of the Father's hand in what we've got. So we could go on and on, actually, in discussing those affairs, those matters. We needed soil to build our oval. And so here's Rupert Murdoch, or his son, they're rebuilding their area. They said, well, what we'll do is we will transfer our soil that we're removing to your site, and we'll level it all out so that you'll have an oval done at no cost to you if you'll take it.
Amazing.
The sort of things that helped us along the way, very much so.
30th of January, 1996. Some final thoughts. You probably already shared, I think your overall theme was pretty clear, but what are your final thoughts when you look back on it?
As we look back, I can only say that it was evidence of a divine hand. It was not my work or our committee's work, Brother Brian, Brother Bruce, who were deeply involved in it, the teachers, Bill Lund. It was a divine hand, as we said.
So the school's gone from strength to strength. There's, I think, over 400
That's right.
Students there now. And of course, it's multiplied in the sense that there's schools in other states and cities around Australia. So it's extraordinary to look back over 30 years of history this month.
Yes, that's right. No, it is. I think it had demonstrated to us that it could be done with the Father's blessing. And of course, in the meanwhile, then we had our sister schools being developed in Lake Macquarie, Sydney, and I think it was Perth and then Melbourne.
Really appreciate you sharing the story, James. Thanks for joining Wilderness Conversations.
That's lovely, Steve, and I'm pleased that it's a story that should never be forgotten. It's the hand of God in these last days, helping us with our children and preparing them for the future. Thanks, Steve.